Rachel, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you and I have talked off the air a couple times about what seems to be one of your major topics of interest, and that's gun rights, or the opposite, provisions to protect victims of gun violence. But before we get into any of the specifics, I want to know, why are you interested in this topic? What throughout your life led you to this passion?
Yeah, so I'm only 20 years old, and I grew up in a generation full of lockdown drills, school shootings, plastered in the news, everywhere. And I went to Columbine High School, so I always grew up in a community knowing what happened there and the tragedy that occurred and took 13 lives. And then I went to that school, and I walked the halls that those students walked in. I visited, the cafeteria, the library, everywhere, the memorial. It was always a part of my life. And then later, as I got through high school, there were shootings like the Parkland shooting. And that really kind of spurred something in me where I was like, why is this still happening 20 years later? And I thought, I was inspired by other students across the country speaking up about the issue. And I wanted to do something myself. So I started getting involved in gun violence prevention. And it kind of started from there. And now I go to CU Boulder, and I was actually at the King Soopers gas station when the King Soopers shooting happened here in Boulder. And that kind of like reignited a fire within me about this issue. And it still feels like things haven't changed, which is really sad, but I'm hoping that something can be done to prevent these tragedies.
So, draw the bridge for me then from this is why I'm passionate about it to here's how I'm getting involved. Because I know anyone could just say, this is terrible, this is traumatic, shootings happen and I feel traumatized or whatever. But from our conversations, you've actually tried to be physically involved in some of these things. What have you tried to be involved with or successfully been involved in that's relevant here?
So most of the things that I've done are with the state government in Colorado. So I've testified for bills, I've lobbied at the state capitol. One of my biggest accomplishments, I would say, is aiding in the passage of the Colorado Extreme Risk Protection Order, which is commonly referred to as a red flag law. So it temporarily removes firearms from the hands of people who may be deemed a risk to themselves or others. And they go through due process, of course, and they have the chance to get their guns back. But it's just a precautionary measure to help those people. And the bill does allow them to get some sort of help. And I think that's a big area that we need to target is people who need help. And a lot of people say that, oh, it's not the firearm, it's the mental health aspect of this issue. And while it's a little bit of both, those people who have access to the firearms are going to be the ones who cause problems. So if we can kind of eliminate both of those aspects, we can remove those guns and then also address their mental health. I think that's a great approach. So I've been really fortunate to be a part of a lot of those conversations. And of course, I've been a part of, rallies, voter registration drives, things like that are on the issue too.
So let's really dig into this then. You mentioned the mental health aspect, and you mentioned the actual access to weapons aspect. Let's pin this down and flesh out your opinion here. If you have to pick one, which is more important to address?
Well, I mean, the common denominator here is the gun. And I think everyone can agree that there are some people in this world who should not have access to a gun. And I firmly believe in the Second Amendment. I believe that people, law-abiding citizens, should have the right to own a gun for hunting, recreation, protecting themselves, things like that. But some people should not be allowed to have those guns. And that's why I support legislation like universal background checks, which we don't have across the country. We have them in Colorado, which is a great step forward. But having them federally would be a great step forward. So I support legislation that allows law-abiding citizens to have those guns, to use them for whatever purpose they deem fit, and then kind of check the people who maybe shouldn't have access to a gun and make sure that those guns don't get into the wrong hands.
I always wonder about background checks because it's really hard to know what's true. And this is just, I suppose, a microcosm of all of our media today, right? It's so freaking hard to know what to trust. But from your knowledge, which I'm going to assume is orders of magnitude more than mine, how much is really, how many weapons are really being sold to people who aren't having background checks? Like you often hear, oh, there's the loopholes at these events and so forth. Is that real, or is that a progressive talking point to stir policy, even if it's well-intentioned? To what extent is that real?
It absolutely is real. After the Columbine shooting, they did try to close some of those loopholes, and one that's commonly talked about today is the gun show loophole. So in a lot of states, you could go to a gun show and buy a gun without having to go through that background check process. A lot of states have tackled that issue, which is great. But then there's a lot of other things, and a lot of conservative talking points tend to say that, well, a lot of these guns are sold in the black market, which is true. A lot of people acquire these guns illegally. And so we need to address, both of those areas because, in those scenarios, like, it's hard to be able to track those things and put a stop to them. But then I argue that, well, even if a lot of people who are going to commit these crimes are getting them off the dark web or the black market, why should we make it easy for them to get them legally? So I think making it harder to get them for a person like that legally is a deterrent. It's not easy to just go to the black market and buy a gun. You have to know people. You have to go through a process of figuring that out. People that just have a spur of the moment urge to kill someone aren't going to be able to do that. But they could go to a gun shop and just buy a gun. So deterring them in that area, I think, is effective because we shouldn't be making it easier for killers to get access to those weapons.
To push back on that somewhat, using what I perceive as progressive arguments, isn't it often said that in relation to drugs, for example, whenever you criminalize drugs, it actually doesn't reduce drug use. All it does is increase the danger. You hear similar arguments with abortion, too. So why would it be different for guns? Why would that actually be a deterrent in this case?
Well, I think in terms of drugs and abortions, it's more dangerous because those drugs could be laced with something, or the abortions would happen, in a back alley or something. In terms of guns, the worst that could happen is during a gun sale, someone could get hurt, which is sad, but if they're going to buy this gun illegally, it's likely that they don't have good intentions with it anyway, because if they were a true law-abiding citizen, they could go through the process of getting it legally. And I don't think that anyone should be using illegal processes to buy guns, drugs, anything. But because of the Second Amendment, of course, we have alleyways to get guns. But drugs, most of the time, there's no legal access point to those things. So if someone truly has good intentions and is a law-abiding citizen, they really shouldn't have that much of a problem getting a gun. They may have to go through a waiting period, background check. But like I said, if they are law-abiding, that shouldn't be that much of an issue.
So just to make sure this is clear, because if I were to just turn on my TV and go to a standard conservative news site, let's just say Fox News, the MSNBC equivalent, give or take, right? The argument would actually be that progressives who are for gun regulation, which we can get into the specifics of, actually don't want law-abiding citizens to have this full range of rights. It's a restriction on every American. So to what extent is this restriction that you see as beneficial on people who are not law-abiding? And to what extent do you want to further restrict law-abiding citizens from buying, let's say, certain types of guns or having access to certain hunting seasons that have been lengthened, whatever the arguments are? To what extent are you against the illegal use of guns, which I think everyone agrees on, And to what extent would the average conservative media be correct in saying that, no, Rachel actually wants your magazine to be down to 4 bullets, and it has to be semi-auto, and you can shoot once every 4 seconds, right? Is that what you're saying? And if so, get into that.
Well, I think in the gun violence prevention movement itself, the people who are really educated on this topic, no one wants to just ban guns completely. I think most of us believe in the Second Amendment, and that talking point that we just want to ban all guns is incorrect, because that's not true. I know a lot of people in this movement who are progressive, but they also own guns. And they're, law-abiding citizens. They're there for protection, or they're there for hunting, things like that. I think, and Colton brought this up, I think bans on certain weapons is a bit more controversial, like assault weapons. That is a big topic of conversation. And I personally do believe in an assault weapons ban. There was a ban about a decade and a half ago on assault weapons in the United States, and it was extremely effective. It decreased mass shootings by more than 100, I don't know the right statistic, but it was quite a bit. And if you look at Gifford Law Center, it has all of that information on there. And this ban, worked. And the argument against assault weapons is that these are weapons used to kill many people in a very short amount of time. These are weapons of war. You're not going to bring an assault weapon, an AR-15, let's say, to go hunt a deer. It would absolutely destroy the deer, and you wouldn't have any salvageable meat or anything. In terms of protection, it's a little bit more difficult in that area, but there are a lot more guns, say a handgun, that do serve that purpose. Assault weapons are so big, it may be hard to get them out of a safe in time to protect yourself, whereas a handgun is a lot easier to acquire in a short amount of time, and concealed carry places. You can have a concealed carry handgun more easily than you can have a concealed carry assault weapon. The biggest argument that I've heard against assault weapons is that they're necessary to, I guess, take over a tyrannical government. And I can see validity in that point, and that's why the Second Amendment was created, was to put checks on a tyrannical government. But then I also argue that it's unlikely that citizens with a few AR-15s would be able to overtake the U.S. military with their much larger weapons of war. And so in day-to-day life, those things are not necessary, and I don't think the average American citizen has a need for them. And other countries, like New Zealand recently banned assault weapons, and it's worked really well for them. So I don't see many reasons why assault weapons are necessary in day-to-day life for American citizens.
Well, let's get into that tyrannical piece, because it seems possible you and I would agree that the average American doesn't need that because the government's not tyrannical, and even if it were, what are you going to do to fight it, right? The problem is, what is reality? It's your perception. And what is the apparently growing perception in America? Well, there's some very startling statistics around what percent of Americans think the election was stolen, for example. Or even just look at the Canadian border right now in Ottawa. That is going to be a fascinating play of the cards, because a federal court in Canada has stated that the road needs to be cleared. Well, that's going to just, I assume, blow up on the internet, right? So then you get to a point where no one really knows the true number of people. Let's just say Americans for simplicity. It could be 1%, could be 30%, somewhere in that vast range, who think this might be the last straw. And you saw this with January of last year, gun purchases doubled, I think, to 2 million in just that 1 month. Which 2 million sounds like a huge number. In America, it's already pushing 1 million a month anyways, from my understanding, but a huge increase. So now you have some large percentage of people who, some of which were probably more moderate Democrats trying to buy a gun out of fear for their life too, I would guess, which might be an interesting thing to unpack. But what if it's the case where this minority only grows and grows? This perception whether because of algorithms or because it's real and maybe I just don't understand it. It doesn't actually matter the truth for this hypothetical. If this perception grows, well, now you have half the country, let's just say, who thinks the government is tyrannical. And de facto Second Amendment, I should be able to defend myself. I need an assault weapon. I'm going to take on the U.S. military, let's say. I mean, they're not going to nuke the country. That would just destroy it. So the major weapons of war are off the table. So you can see how someone could say, okay, I can see that jump. I take out the infrastructure. We're all just in a warfare state here. I hate to be pessimistic about the world we're in right now, but can't you see where that state of mind is at right now and how people could say, this is proof that we need more lenient Second Amendment rights? Because look what's happening in the world. Look what Trudeau is doing. Look what Biden is doing or not doing because he's asleep, right? These are what's being said. Do you see what's happening there? Do you find anything compelling about that argument?
I don't know. I can understand it to an extent, but that would only lead to a massively destructive, I guess, war in our country if that were to happen. Like I said, it's unlikely. Well, it does depend on how many citizens decide to take up arms against the government. It's unlikely that they'd be able to overtake the United States military. And we are polarized in this nation. And I don't think that polarization is going to go away anytime soon. And so I also think it's unlikely that most of the country would, decide to purchase an assault weapon and then go fight against the government. And that could lead to a whole civil war. And without the assault weapons, I think fewer people would die, which...
it would just be a slower war is all that would happen.
Yeah, it's tough. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think... and I had a professor actually give me this argument when I wrote a paper about banning assault weapons. And that was his biggest argument was, well, look at other countries right now who are overthrowing tyrannical governments. And I suppose that's valid in other countries, but I don't see that happening in the United States without some big shift, I think. And despite, news coverage and everything, I still believe in, the democracy of this country, and I think that most Americans do. And until that drastically changes, I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon.
I appreciate your optimism. That's very good.
Thanks. I mean, why live a pessimistic life? What is that going to do?
Well, there's enough to be pessimistic about, I must say.
Oh, yeah.
So aside from tyrannical government, then, let's shift back to school shootings.
Yeah.
I know you're not a psychologist here, but let's unpack why that happens. Because you mentioned at the beginning, mental health is a factor, having access to a gun is a factor. I think it's fair to say that, and this is an argument you hear a lot, you could have other weapons. I mean, if you bring a knife to school and you slit 4 people's throat before they realize it, well, maybe you didn't shoot 8 people, but you still killed some number of people, right? So at what point does having a gun in particular raise the stakes? How does that differentiate itself from just someone who has mental illness and it's the person who's killing people, not the gun who's killing people, right? Where is that line in your eyes?
Well, in terms of the knife argument, it's a lot easier to subdue someone with a knife than with an AR-15. And how many mass knifings have we had in the United States recently? It doesn't happen very often. And sure, if all guns were banned, maybe we would see those more often. But knife wounds are a lot less likely to be fatal. With an assault weapon, you can fire many bullets in a short amount of time. Whereas with a knife, you can only stab so often in certain places. So it's a lot less likely that it'll be massively destructive than with a gun. And I think, and this is a whole different issue with gun violence prevention, but many shooters nowadays, they do it, I think, in part for notoriety. a lot of them are copycats of the Columbine shooting. And I think something that we can do to prevent that is give them no notoriety on the news, and when we're talking about them, focus on the victims instead of the shooter. And I think that could help potentially thwart some people who are just looking for fame.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that shooters in the past have like really enjoyed the attention in prison or in court, and whatever we can do to prevent that, I think, is a step in the right direction. But another thing is school shootings are a very, very small percentage of gun violence. And so we do a lot to prevent them. We do lockdown drills, and we can argue how effective those are. We have security in schools. I mean, going to Columbine, we had a ton of security in our school. And I do think those things do help a little bit. But yeah, in terms of shooters in general, I think no notoriety is a good thing to do, and then focusing on other types of shootings is also what we need to be doing as well.
So what are these largest cases of gun violence? What is that? Because school shootings gets the most headlines because obviously it's children involved and it's traumatic and all these things. But where is most of the shooting happening?
Yeah, so the most common type of death by a firearm is suicide. So, and I believe the most recent stats that I've seen, it's been more than 50% of gun violence is suicides. And like I said, you can look at the Giffords Law Center and they'll have this information for you. But yeah, almost all, not almost all, but about half the time it's suicide by firearm. And in looking at suicide statistics, firearms are the most fatal method of suicides. And so that's why I think things like the red flag law, which temporarily removes guns from people who are a risk to themselves or others, the key word there is themselves. A lot of times those people are really struggling, and if they have access to a gun, they have a depressive episode or some like emotion, and they decide to just pick up the gun and shoot themselves, there's no going back.
Red flag laws, how does that work in practice? How does someone get on the list, so to speak?
Yeah, so Colorado has a good example of this, and I think a few other states have it as well. So you can either have a close family member report someone as needing their gun to be taken away, or police officers can do it. And that's a whole different conversation, whether or not police officers have the right to do that. But that's most of the cases. And it doesn't happen as often as you'd think. But we have had a few hundred cases, I want to say, in Colorado where this has worked, and those people have been able to get help that they need, and then hopefully get their firearms back when they're in a better state.
Okay, let's talk police since you brought it up. I often see, the algorithms on YouTube do you wonders, and I'll start looking at, police videos or something once or twice, and then my whole feed will get filled with them, and sometimes there'll be police from other countries. And I've seen others, based on my ignorant American understanding of global accents, I assume it's somewhere in Great Britain, right? And I see, they have tasers, but they're not carrying guns in London. I could be making this up, but it seemed to be the case. From my understanding of how people talk about guns globally, it's not the case that all police officers have them to the same extent we do.
Yeah.
Do you think they should go away and say, look at these other countries, their police don't have weapons to the same extent, they don't have as many acts of violence by police? Ever since George Floyd, it's brought to the attention against minorities, for example. Or is that not a fair argument because, Americans buy 1 million guns a month, give or take. Therefore, the police need to also have guns. It's just a different system. To what extent do the police fit in here?
So I'm not a person of color, and I won't say that I understand the struggle that they have with police. But I think I have a unique perspective here because I don't want to abolish the police. And I do believe that some of them should have guns for the purpose of, disarming shooters. In the Boulder shooting, there was an officer, Eric Talley, and he went into the King Supers, and he faced off with the shooter and unfortunately lost his life. But without him there, the shooter could have killed many more people. And and there are many other cases like that where a police officer does subdue a shooter. And then it doesn't always happen. There are lots of instances, like in the Parkland shooting, where their school resource officer, I'm unaware if he had a gun or not, he was unable to subdue that shooter. But I do think people who have guns and people who are trained police officers should be available in those instances, because I think without them it'd lead to further loss of life. If a police officer goes in there with a taser, that's not going to be as effective. The shooter could just shoot them from 50 feet away, depending on the gun they have, and that's just more casualties, and we don't want to see that. And so I think police are necessary for that purpose, and I don't know an alternative that we would have except good Samaritans with guns. And I think that is just a whole nother can of worms, because those people could risk losing their lives, and then those people could be mistaken as shooters as well. So it's hard, and I definitely agree that there needs to be some police reform, because police brutality is a real issue and it does need to be addressed in some way, but abolishing the police isn't the answer because of instances like these.
If you don't mind pivoting slightly, let's dig into police reform a little bit, if you have any thoughts, because you and I have talked, and I'm very much opposed to the idea of abolishing police. To be fair, even people who were originally using this term to mean abolish the police have now since said, no, I didn't mean that. It was just metaphorical. Now, I don't really buy that in many cases, but nonetheless, it doesn't really mean abolish police anymore. It just means restructure it, which, if that's what it meant, I would say your argument should have been restructure the police from the get-go. That's just a personal opinion. But let's go there. So where do you think, from your view, someone who has been thinking about guns in particular for a long time, as well as being involved in from student governments all the way up to state or maybe even federal government policy and just things like this, you see the impacts of these of policies and things like that. So where does police have room to reform, and what does that actually mean? Not what does the abolish the police crew think it means, not what does someone on the opposite end of the spectrum trying to caricature it as. Like, what does it actually mean in your eyes that's beneficial for helping, let's say, minorities or what have you, but also not taking away from the value that policing does give us in this case, a very gun-heavy society?
So I believe Colorado implemented a program where they would send people without weapons to like non-violent calls, like someone in distress or something, and I think that really helped. And I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they sent some sort of mental health specialist, something along those lines.
I know Boulder does. I don't know if the whole state did.
I thought the whole state did something along those lines. I'm not quite sure. And I think that's a good step in the right direction. I think when there's not like a violent event occurring, do we need someone with a gun? I don't think we necessarily do. And as I've mentioned previously, I don't think guns are necessary, like, unless like they're there to protect you. And so if something violent's not going on, then you don't necessarily need one. And I think it would lead to a lot fewer casualties for both citizens and police officers without any weapons there. So if the person that calls or is called about doesn't have a weapon, I don't believe police should bring one at all.
So then, when you say weapon, I assume you mean gun, but still have a taser or something like that. Some kind of non-lethal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Interesting. So then what about... Let's go into something like racism then. There's all kinds of conversations around police reform to be proactive towards racism. And the statistics are always really interesting because anybody who knows anything about statistics knows you can make them say just about anything if you try hard enough. But it is fair to say that I think across the board it is factually correct that there are higher altercation rates between minorities and police officers than white Americans and police officers. That's factually true.
Mm-hmm.
What isn't as clear and what's been really challenging to look into is actual fatality rates from police shooting individuals whenever you account for crime rates, which seems to me to be an obvious confounding variable here, right? Because obviously if there's more crime, then you'd have to have more violence, give or take. But then those rates are pretty comparable. There's not minorities are getting shot a lot more. But statistics like that don't feel right in the age of George Floyd, right? So what solutions have you thought of, if any, or even just ideas you've heard that can help police reform in some sense that not only helps the violence itself and what violence is potentially there or is not there, but also the perception? The only thing I've heard is being able to hold police officers accountable for force hopping between stations and things like that, maybe a statewide or nationwide database, something like that. But that's the only one I've heard. Are there other ideas you've heard to help with this from a, let's just say, minority perception take as well?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm not a minority, and so I don't have that perspective. But I do understand that police brutality is a systemically racist issue, and there is systemic racism in police. And it definitely needs to be addressed. But then, the whole country is systemically racist. And without addressing that, how can we adequately address all the little things in the country? And that's a huge debate and a huge issue. But I think, in terms of police, little things like making sure their body cams are on and active at all times, allowing bystanders to record interactions, and I guess not shooting first. Like we hear shoot first, ask questions later. That is not correct. We've seen time and time again where police will shoot someone and then it turns out that they were holding a toy or something when they thought it was a gun. I mean, I just can't understand how you could get in that situation where you just shoot someone without even thinking about it, without asking questions. And I think that's wrong of police to do. They're trained for these interactions and they should be trained better if they don't know how to approach these situations correctly. So and it's hard. And George Floyd wasn't killed by a gun, but it's the same principle where he was just pretty much attacked by these officers, and they weren't really asking him questions. They just brutally murdered him. And so I don't know. I think we need, I guess, more training. And if a police officer does something like this, they should be fired. They shouldn't be put on, leave, like a lot of them are. They really should be fired and they should be tried in court. And, it differs by case, of course, and we have gotten some sense of justice in some cases, but most of the time they do not even go to court. We don't see any sort of justice at all. So I don't know. I think the country has made some good steps in the past few years, but definitely not enough to solve the issue. But like I said, it's such a complicated issue and there's no just fix for everything.
I want you to try and play the other side of the argument here. Do you think it's possible that there are any downsides? And I'll make this specific, a specific question to address. Are there any downsides to this extension of what you might call cancel culture to police that have these incidents? For example, I forget the police officer's name, but she, I believe, was 2 decades on the job, and the video cam was her saying, taser, 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 and she shoots somebody. she obviously made a mistake. Now, is it a stupid mistake that kills somebody and you should be fired and maybe even go to jail for inadvertent murder? Yeah, if that's the legal code, absolutely. No exemptions because you're an officer. But obviously a mistake. Obviously. I mean, I don't know anyone who could see that and say, yep, that's a racist in cold blood. And I mean, if you disagree, feel free to disagree. But cases like that, or there's other cases that look awfully similar to George Floyd's case, just somewhere on the line between, on the spectrum between negligence and intentional harm, where it seems like it's probably more negligence, but in the world of, videotaping things, which is very wonderful, it can come across as intentional harm, especially if you're a minority, right? Because of the history behind this. But there are cases like this of very similar instances happening to white people, and they may happen way less. I don't know these numbers, and I bet you do more than I do. But they exist on YouTube. You could find them. Just people, 3 officers sit on a guy's back for 40 minutes and he dies because the human body can't take it, right? And that seems similar to George Floyd's case. The neck and the knee on the neck certainly played a role, obviously, but a lot of it has to do with the body weight on your back, which people don't talk about. Nonetheless, do you ever think there's validity in the argument that even if everything you're saying is 100% true, which maybe I agree, maybe I don't, but if everything's 100% true, that it still could be dangerous to cancel for mistakes? Not legally punish, but to cancel and then depict a department as racist, for example, if something was clearly a mistake. I'm not saying George Floyd fits into this example, but someone who says, taser, 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 by policy, 20 years on the force, and she obviously didn't mean to shoot the person, freaks out afterwards because she knew it was a mistake and it's horrendous. Oh, I guess she's a racist. That doesn't really fit the bill. You see what I'm saying? Do you see any validity in that argument that there also has to be caution, not on the policing side, because obviously there's weapons that can kill you, but also on the societal side of not ending people's lives, not just in a practical way, but in a way where they are excluded from society, painting them in a way that isn't fair to them or their departments and so forth. Do you see any fair arguments in there at all?
I mean, yeah, we're humans. We all make mistakes. That's very true. But if your mistake leads to ending someone else's life, there should be repercussions. Like if you hit someone with your car by accident, it's manslaughter. You can go to jail.
Canceling, not legal repercussions. I mean societal. We despise this person, not because, let's say because they were racist. Imagine you ran someone over and they were black on accident, and you're a white person. Is that a racist and we should cancel them beyond just legal repercussions? That's what I'm hinting at here.
Well, no, in that case, I wouldn't say that's necessarily racist. And of course, it does depend on each case. But we have to also acknowledge the implicit biases that exist in our society. And so if a white person, this is all in the head, so there's no way to really know this. But if a white person, a white police officer, sees a white guy with a toy gun and a black guy with a toy gun, I think you could argue that they're more likely to shoot or attack the black person just because of internal biases. And that is our job as white people, to fight against those biases. And it's difficult because those are ingrained in our society. And we, a lot of police officers, have lived since, their parents went to segregated schools. These things segregation was recent, and those notions still exist in our society. And we can't just escape them. And so, whether that person knows it or not, it could be just internal biases against black people. And I guess in terms of canceling them, like I said, it depends on the case. But that is something that we should consider when we're discussing those things.
You bring up implicit bias, and admittedly, I'm going to guess I'm not as convinced to the extent of implicit bias in our country. But even that aside, because I'm not as well read as you are on the topic, the real question is, if this is the case, and the evidence says so, and you've seen the evidence more than I have, so I'll just take your word here. If that's the case, then what do we do about it? Because implicit bias training, from any studies I've seen, has not shown any statistically significant benefits. It doesn't, and maybe it will someday. Maybe the training hasn't figured itself out. It's possible. But it seems to me it doesn't actually work. If by work you mean having some measurable effect. That's positive, right? Mm-hmm. And that could mean the training's bad. It could mean our understanding of the biases is wrong, which I know you would disagree with. But how do we really address this? Is it education? Is it K through 12? Do we have to, is this tied into what people call critical race theory today? Although that's being talked about in ways that we haven't delineated between academic CRT and K through 12, what that means, and I still really don't know the details. But, how do we solve this? If this is a real societal problem, I suppose on one lens, racially, if you want to continue that conversation, but also from a gun rights perspective, just how do we educate individuals or help individuals find the best solutions without having to take this I'm the government and I'm going to do it because I said so approach that will not fly in America. It doesn't work.
So I think it's a mix of a lot of things. I do think racial trainings in like workplaces or like schools, I think those can help. It depends who's giving them and what they're about. I think reading books, watching documentaries, and then having day-to-day experiences with racial minorities, I think, is one of the biggest things. And like, you're not just gonna like go to, a minority neighborhood and just like start talking to people, because it's not their job to educate white people on those things. But I think these systemic inequalities and these implicit biases, like these root in segregation and having segregated neighborhoods. And to this day, we still like have largely segregated neighborhoods. That's not by law. That's just by where people live. And a lot of minority communities their families have lived there all their lives, and it's segregated whether or not like it is by law or on the surface. And that is a whole other issue that I don't think can be fixed immediately. We can't just force people of color to move to white communities. That would be really, I think, traumatic for those people. But I think slowly society is becoming more integrated, but it won't be fixed for like years or even decades. So I think right now it's our job to work towards that future that we want to see, and addressing those like smaller systemic barriers like the neighborhoods, thinking about how we can best like, I don't know the right word, like invite people of color into our spaces and like make sure they feel welcome. A lot of times like at CU, we'll all be in a class, there's only one black person in the class. And like that probably does not feel as welcoming as, being in an entire classroom full of people who look like you. And I don't know, and listening to those people when they say that you're being racist. Because a lot of the times, I think white people don't realize what they're saying is racist. And someone will call them out and they'll be like, oh, it's a joke, or I didn't mean that. But really listening and trying not to repeat those things. I think those are really like small things that we can do. But believing people of color, believing their stories, that's a big thing. And talking to your relatives, your neighbors, your friends who may not believe in those things, because there are quite a few people who don't believe America's racist. And that's part of the problem, is how is it going to get better if people aren't acknowledging the problem? So I think there's a lot of things that we can do, but once again, it's a problem that can't be fixed in a short amount of time, if ever. And that's sad to say, but we can take steps to get better. I think that's what we should be working on.
I have two thoughts.
Okay.
First, I do wonder, because I think I agree with you to the extent that the best way to understand people, and I've seen some statistics around this for individuals who have been publicly come out as gay, for example, and then they reconnect with their parents, and then they measure the whatever. They measure how much the parents despise them, whatever. I don't know how they exactly set these studies up, but I assume it's going to be similar with people of different races. And my inclination is, it sounds like the same as yours, that one of the best ways, if not the best way, is to just get to know people, right? Just get out of your bubble. But it always makes me wonder, and I'm always on the losing side of this argument by a landslide, and I want you to maybe help me understand a little bit better. When I think about someone who's racist, you can have gradation here. At the very one extreme would be something like my political psychology class, where we were taught that everyone who doesn't believe in affirmative action is a racist, a new racist it was called. That struck me as interesting, but that's to one extreme. But then you have gradation to individuals in the other extreme are white supremacists, right? But there seems to be this conflating here between white supremacists and everyone who just has some level of implicit whiteness, as the term is also coined. And it confuses me a bit, because I often think, if someone says, for example, I have black friends, right? A white person says that. You were just laughed out of the room. It's like, what a joke. You're obviously doesn't mean anything. Unpack that for me, because I don't know anyone who's on the level of white supremacist who would possibly be a friend. And by friend, you have to mean someone who you would put their values first. If you're best friend, someone you would die for, right? Like, that's someone you deeply care about from a different race. Is it fair to say that person is on a similar level to a white supremacist, right? Because that's the kind of vernacular I hear. And if you think that's the case, explain to me how that is. Because I've never understood how you can just get laughed at for saying that if you really mean a friend. Not just, I met a guy who's black and we go to classes and, he daps me up instead of a handshake. So, I understand them. Like, not like that. I mean, actually a friend, right? Why is that not a real argument to say, clearly I'm not a Klan member? Why can't, let's just start there. You know what I mean? But you'll get laughed at if you say that.
I think not many people in the United States are true, like, white supremacists, like Nazis. I think that is definitely a minority in the country. But I think a lot of people, because white people can never understand the experience of people of color, I think that's why you may, like, get laughed at for saying, I have friends who are black. Because even if that's the case, you may be an ally. You may be a great ally. That doesn't mean that you don't have racist thoughts sometimes. That doesn't mean you understand what they go through. And I think it's wrong to, like, speak on those issues as if you know what they're going through. And they can tell you their whole life story and you still won't understand because you never lived it. And, like, racism is definitely a spectrum. There are people who are really racist, people who are not so racist. And I think a lot of, like, the racism that we see nowadays are people making, jokes at others' expenses. People who don't believe that there's racism in the country. I think that's inherently racist. I think, like, that's how we see racism nowadays. Like, most commonly nowadays is, like, little things like that. And people who have racist thoughts. And I think all white people have had a racist thought. I think that's... sure.
Are you outing yourself right now?
I think every white person has at some time had, racial biases, because that's ingrained in our society. And the way we move forward is addressing those, understanding that they're wrong, and then doing our best to work forward from that.
So what's the goal then, in your eyes? Because I think if we don't have a clear goal, or at least a clear understanding of the right direction, at least, we can get lost in the tug and pull of the political discourse, and how far left can I go and how far anti-left can I go the other way. It's just, I don't actually know what we're trying to achieve. And that was a common criticism of some, BLM tenants and things. And we don't have to get into all the riots, because that's a whole nother conversation. Is it a riot? Is it speaking your mind? Where there are plants, you hear similar arguments all the time. But what is the goal in your eyes? Is it, because you mentioned, we can't just forcefully integrate everyone. That wouldn't be beneficial. Is that the goal, really? Is it to say everyone is 100% involved in everything exactly the same? Because what I've come to realize, and this seems to be a recent phenomenon, I guess ever since we stopped thinking colorblind laws were reasonable, 15 years ago, whenever that was, that, okay, we have different cultures or different identities. As identity politics have grown, and admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of identity politics, but it seems to me you can't say everyone is so different. We all have our own unique identities and experiences and cultures, and we're just going to have, different ways of community and all different languages, different religions, all these kinds of things, and then say, but we have to be perfectly integrated. You can't have both. And there are definitely pros and cons to either, right? You can say, well, if we're not perfectly integrated, then it's easier to have biases by whatever majority is in power. It's white people right now. At some point, it'll probably be Hispanic in America. Obviously, the institutions wouldn't change that quickly because who are the CEOs, right? It's going to be white people and their lineages. But if you talk just purely Democratic majority, it's not going to be white people. And that's another fun conversation. That's going to happen pretty soon, actually. But it is, there's a real argument to be had there between which is more beneficial. So I want your thoughts. Is it the cultures are what are priority, but then you see the dangers, obviously? Or is it, no, we really need to all be equality of outcome, and we're just going to ignore unique identities?
I think the goal at the end of the day is making it so that people of color's lives are not harder because of their skin color. But that's not to say that their skin color doesn't matter and that their cultures don't matter. I think the US is great because we have a lot of rich cultures here. And I think erasing those would be an injustice. But I would like to get to a point in the country where people of color's lives are not harder because of their skin color. And their lives can still be hard for other reasons, but if it's made harder because of their skin color, then we have not achieved what we want to achieve.
Now, when you say harder, I want to really pin this down because this is something I get into debates about a lot, especially on campus here, in Boulder. The common argument is we want equality of outcome. Full stop. Cross sexes, cross races. Is that what you would like? Is it where if you can get to a point, and I don't know what this would look like, where you can substantially claim that, yes, there is equality of opportunity, redlining, there's no evidence of it anymore, there's no, clearly systemic issues, police are actually held accountable. What that looks like, how long it takes, who knows? But if you get to that point, and the outcomes are different, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 1%, maybe it's 20%, who knows? Then what? Would you be in favor of saying, well, no, we're going to still continue to advantage people from, let's say, minority backgrounds, like an affirmative action type philosophy, even if there is absolute equal opportunity? Or is that the point where you would say everyone does have equal opportunity? And I don't just mean de jure in law. I mean implicitly there's no longer this bias, let's say, if I'm depicting your arguments right. Then the outcome, we just live with it, right? So where do you lie on that?
Well, yeah, I think that ideal world would be great. That's a world that I would want to live in, where people's lives are not made harder because of their skin color. Everyone has equal privilege based on their skin color, and equal outcome, opportunity, everything.
Those are two differences, and that's where I want your thoughts, because outcome may not be the same. If you do admit different cultures, they might not be the same. Is that okay in your eyes?
Well, that's the argument, is that everyone has equality of opportunity right now, but they don't, because of, I think true equality of opportunity is where like I've been saying, their lives are not made harder because of their skin color, and that everyone, regardless of skin color, has true access to the opportunity. And of course, outcome's not gonna be the same for everyone. That's life. And but if there's a disparity between the outcome of white people and the outcome of black people, then there's still work to be done, because then that's not true equality of opportunity.
Well, that's what I'm trying to hit at then, because to what extent then do you think, and I don't like taking this argument because it can be misconstrued very, very poorly, but to what extent could we accept cultural differences? To what extent, for example, you saw this with the, I think it was the Asian Student Alliance was the name of it at Harvard, right? They sued and said, well, we have a disadvantage now, even more so than white people. That was kind of their argument, right?
I've seen that.
So what happens when Asians are treated equally to white people, but they have different outcomes, right? Do we need to account? Let me just say it like this. Is noticing differences in outcomes a one-to-one bridge that says, oh, look, that means for a fact there's also inequality of opportunity? Is that a direct correlate in your eyes? And there may not be a perfect answer. We don't have infinite knowledge, right? But I just want your thoughts. Is it outcomes are different, therefore it's clear opportunities must be different? Cultures don't play any role here in that.
I think definitely the outcome reflects the opportunity. I'm a stats major, and so like I think of this like in terms of an input and output of data. So I'm sure many of you have seen like the normal curve, the bell curve, and if you simulate values, you'll see that curve pop up almost all the time. If you saw like a really skewed left graph, all your outputs are skewed left. There's something wrong with your inputs. And so I think like true equality of opportunity would lead to like a distribution like that and outcome. And so if we're looking and we see a really like skewed outcome, then we have to look at, well, there must be some inequality in the input. And I do think in a truly like ideal, perfect world with no racism, affirmative action wouldn't be necessary. But I think we would still have like those cultures because I think those are important. But yeah, in terms of outcome, I think we do need to look at the opportunity as well.
So then statistically, is it fair to say that you would claim that the confounding variables of cultural difference are negligible in the sense that it's truly this pipeline from input to output, from opportunity to outcome, and that these confounding variables, they don't play a big enough role, and maybe individuals on the right are just using this as a talking point? You really don't think those are actually substantial variables at play here? It's more or less a direct relationship, input to output.
Yeah, I think, well, currently, like, there's definitely issues with, like, systemic racism. And that's why we have things like affirmative action, is, like, to help combat those issues. And culture definitely ties into that. Like, religion, that's sometimes tied to race. And, like, those things all definitely play a role. And so in an ideal world, those factors would still exist, but they wouldn't play a role in that person's opportunity or outcome.
Or preferences?
Yeah.
Because preferences, that's a really interesting one to get off the race topic slightly. That's something you saw a lot in some Scandinavian countries where they seem to be globally the most advanced, the best equality of opportunity. But what's happened is the outcomes have actually gotten, quote unquote, worse for men and women. There's more women teachers and nurses and more male contract laborers, whatever. Now, I think it's fair to say that the difference there between men and women is more substantial and more biological, and you can argue those cases. You have to be careful if you want to argue that across races, but that's where that argument where if I say, oh, but what if there's cultural differences, that can get misconstrued really easily for, because, this minority culture doesn't work hard, right? You have to be careful, obviously. But yeah, that's all really interesting. Do you have any final thoughts on maybe just to mention that website again and where people can find more information on, let's say, gun violence or just information, things like that? Because I'm always interested in getting more educated, and I know you're more educated than I am on this topic.
Yeah, so going back to gun violence, Giffords Law Center, GIFFORDS, that is a fantastic resource for statistics around gun violence, and I believe it also has racial demographics about gun violence, which is really helpful. Other than that, the Brady campaign has been around for decades at this point. They are really helpful in those issues as well, and both of those organizations do a lot of work around the issue, obviously. And Every Town for Gun Safety is another one. All of those organizations do their best to organize around the country. So if you're interested in getting involved, I'm sure you can find a chapter of Students Demand Action, Moms Demand Action, March for Our Lives, everywhere. And I would encourage people who are passionate about these issues, like gun violence, race, police, anything, to talk to your legislators. see what bills are going through, testify at those bills, lobby on your behalf. In my experience, they love to hear students. A lot of times, the student voice is not being heard. There's a lot of professional lobbyists who are, adults, grown adults, and students aren't really there. So when they see a student, I think they're more willing to listen to you. So if you're a student, you're listening, I really encourage you to do that. But yeah, those are great resources. And yeah, I think getting educated about a topic is the best thing you could do to start off if you're passionate.
I couldn't agree more. Rachel, thank you for coming on and talking with me. I'm sure we'll talk more in the future.
Yes, thank you for having me.